Hi guys, how are you today? Imagine, if you will, the quiet world of the medieval countryside, a world where the pace of life was slower, the work was harder, and every meal was a delicate balance between survival and sustenance. The gentle yet persistent cycle of the seasons shaped the lives of those who lived through them, and their food, their very survival, was tied to this rhythmic passage of time. It is easy to romanticize the idea of feasts, of roasted meats and lavish spreads, the shining banquet tables, perhaps glittering with the golden glow of candlelight. But for most, the reality of food in the Middle Ages was far from this dream. The simple task of feeding oneself was often fraught with hardship, and the food on the table was not always something to celebrate. In a world without refrigerators, without preservatives, food was a fragile thing. The faint scent of spoiled meat often lingered in the air. Bread, sometimes hard and stale, sometimes molded, became a daily companion, and yet this was not a world of indulgence. This was the world of necessity, where the options were few, and every morsel of food was both a gift and a challenge. But perhaps we should not think of these foods as gross. Perhaps they were simply the best that could be done, the humble creations born of necessity, of survival. Let us take a quiet journey together through this world, where food was more about endurance than delight, where the simplest of meals carried with them the weight of a difficult existence. If you're as excited as we are to dive into this captivating journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more adventures into the past. Let's uncover the mysteries of the Middle Ages together. Hit that bell icon too, so you're always first in line for the next historical adventure. Picture the life of an ordinary peasant in the heart of winter. The wind howls outside their humble home, and inside, the kitchen remains the warmest place. They do not have the luxury of fresh produce year-round. What they have is whatever was preserved through the long months of harvest. Salted meats, sour bread, and perhaps, if they're lucky, the last of the apples or the hard root vegetables that have withstood the cold. They are not thinking of flavor, not dreaming of the next feast. They are simply doing what they must to endure. The preservation of food was not an art, it was a necessity. Salt, smoke, and drying were the tools that would keep the winter at bay. But even these methods, though ingenious, were imperfect. Meat, left too long in the salt, began to smell sour. Bread, left out in the air, became hard and tough. And still, they ate it, not because it was good, but because it was all they had. This was a world in which food was often as much a burden as it was a blessing. The slow simmering of meats, the chewing of coarse grains, the feeling of a full stomach when all there was to eat was bread and ale. It was not indulgence, but survival. Number E. And so we begin this journey into the often overlooked corners of medieval life, where food was a reflection of the harsh realities of survival. Let us now step deeper into this quiet world, where meals were not about pleasure, but about what could be tolerated in order to live another day. A brief look at food preservation in the medieval era. The quiet art of making food last. Imagine the slow, steady rhythm of life in the medieval kitchen. The air is thick with the scent of smoke, herbs, and the earthy aroma of preserved foods. The flickering light from the fire dances across the walls, casting long shadows, as hands, weathered by time, work quietly to prepare the foods that will sustain the household through the harsh months ahead. In a world without refrigeration, preservation was not a luxury, but a necessity. The quiet art of making food last was essential to survival. The preservation of meat, vegetables, and even fruits was the key to enduring the long winters, when the earth itself seemed to sleep, and the wind howled outside the small homes of those who lived through it. Salt, smoke, and the air itself were their tools, simple yet effective. And it was this humble process, more than any grand feasts, that marked the true heartbeat of medieval life. Salt, nature's preservative, was perhaps the most essential ally to the medieval household. With it, meat could be preserved for months or even years. The salt, massaged into every crevice of the meat, would draw out moisture, preventing decay and allowing it to survive the cold months. Yet even salt had its limitations. The salt could only do so much. Over time, it would lose its appeal, becoming tough, dry, and hard to chew. The faint smell of rancidity might linger in the air, though it was considered a small price to pay for the gift of survival. And so each meal became an act of endurance. The salted ham, the dried fish, the sausages that hung from the rafters, each a reminder of the quiet, unrelenting need to preserve. They were not meals of delight, but meals of necessity. Smoking, too, was an ancient art, one that imparted a deep, earthy flavour to the meats. It was a method that involved time, patience, and a careful balance between heat and smoke. The meat would be hung in the cool air, exposed to the smoke that would slowly weave through every fibre, preserving it while infusing it with a deep, smoky taste. Yet in the quiet smoke of the fire, a layer of bitterness would sometimes settle into the meat, something we today might find too intense. For them, it was simply part of the world. It wasn't meant to be savoured, only tolerated, the taste of necessity. In the slow, meditative dance between flame and meat, the process of smoking was as much about patience as it was about preservation. It was a quiet, drawn-out process, just as much a part of their lives as the slow passing of the seasons. Drying food, too, was a practice passed down through generations, and it was here, in the silence of the sun or the coolness of the wind, that nature's hand played its part. Vegetables, herbs, and fruits would be carefully sliced and laid out in the sun, their moisture slowly evaporating until they were but husks of their former selves. The dried fruits, apples perhaps, would be tucked into corners, their sweetness faded into something more subtle. Herbs would be tied in bundles and hung from rafters, their fragrance slowly ebbing away with time, leaving behind only the memory of their original scent. This quiet, slow process of drying food was another act of survival, unremarkable yet essential. It was the same rhythm as the seasons, slow, steady, and always moving forward. But preservation, though crucial, was not without its failures. The meat, once perfectly salted, could still turn rancid. The cheese, left too long in the cool, damp air, might sour in ways that could no longer be ignored. And yet, this was the reality of medieval life, the constant, quiet battle between preservation and decay. Without modern knowledge of bacteria, without the science to understand spoilage, the medieval household often relied on their senses, sight, smell, and taste. The lingering scent of rot might be ignored or worse, accepted. What could not be saved was thrown away or rendered into something new. Soups, stews, or broths, where the taste of age could be hidden beneath layers of salt, herbs, and whatever else was at hand. In these quiet failures, there was no room for drama. It was simply part of the cycle of life in a time when food was a gift, but also a risk. In the end, the preservation of food in the medieval era was not about perfection, but survival. It was about quiet rituals that stretched through the months, through the seasons, and into the quiet spaces between them. Each method, salting, smoking, drying, was as much an act of patience as it was of practicality. We might think of preservation as an art, but for those in the medieval world, it was a quiet necessity. It was survival, stripped of glamour, and steeped in the simple, unspoken reality of life. As we reflect on this practice, we see not the grossness of their methods, but the endurance of the human spirit, steadfast, slow, and constant through the rhythm of life, even in the most difficult of times. Forgotten grains and fillers, hard, gritty, and bland. Imagine, if you will, a humble kitchen in the heart of medieval life. There is no grandeur here, no delicate fragrances of exotic spices. The shelves are lined with jars of simple grains, rough, gritty, and unrefined. This was the daily bread of the common folk. This was the daily bread of the common folk, the sustenance that would carry them through each day. It was not food meant to delight the senses, but to quiet the hunger. In the absence of finer grains and the rich bounty of modern harvests, the medieval world relied on what it had: rye, barley, and oats. grains that were hardy enough to survive the harsh conditions of the season. That was not the tender wheat or soft flour that would make for delicate loaves. Instead, they were the tough, gritty remnants of the harvest, coarse, unpolished, and far from refined. Rye, barley, and oats were the cornerstones of medieval diets. These grains were sturdy and grew well in the varied climates of Europe, but they were not the soft, fluffy grains of modern bread. No, these grains were rough, with a texture that would have made even the simplest loaf feel more like a chore to chew than a comfort to eat. The rye, dark and dense, might have been used for bread, but the bread would have been hard and dense, crumbling under the pressure of the teeth. The barley, often turned into porridge, could leave a grainy texture that clung to the tongue, offering little more than the satisfaction of a full stomach. Oats, too, in their simplest form, would have been turned into thick, grainy gruel, a far cry from the smoothness we might expect from today's more refined meals. These grains were more than just food. They were a reminder of a time when every meal was an act of endurance, where every bite was filled with the grit and toughness of survival. Bread, the cornerstone of the medieval diet, was rarely a delight. The bread of this time was dense, heavy, and often stale, especially towards the end of the week. Made from the coarser grains like rye, it was not light and airy like the loaves we enjoy today. Instead, it was hard, with a thick crust that required strength to break through. For a peasant, bread was not a treat, but a necessity, a simple loaf that would last days, even weeks, if properly stored. It could often be dry and tough, softened only by the thin broth or stew that might accompany it. And when it was stale, it became even harder, sometimes soaked in water to make it edible again. But to the people of the time, there was no luxury of fresh bread. The stale, hard loaf was a reminder of endurance. It was not about the pleasure of eating. It was about the practicality of filling the stomach and continuing through another day of hard labour. In times of famine, when the harvests were poor and the stores ran low, even these hard grains were not enough. The people of the medieval world sometimes had to turn to more desperate measures to stave off hunger. Tree bark, acorns, and nettles became what we now call hunger foods. They were not chosen for their flavour or texture, but for their ability to provide something, anything, to fill the stomach. Tree bark, with its bitter taste and tough texture, would have been scraped and processed to remove the most unpleasant parts before being consumed. Acorns, though difficult to digest and slightly toxic if not prepared correctly, could be ground into flour and mixed into a dull, gritty porridge. It was not a meal to savour, but to survive on. Pottage and gruel, the staple of the medieval peasant diet. These simple dishes were nothing more than a mixture of whatever ingredients were available: grains, water, a few vegetables, perhaps some leftover scraps of meat. It was not a dish of flavour, but a dish of necessity. A simple, hearty stew or thin porridge that would fill the stomach, but little else. The grains would be boiled for hours, softened into a thick, somewhat slimy texture. The vegetables, if they were available, might have been overcooked and tasteless. The result was a bland, unappetizing meal that would be eaten without a second thought. It was not a meal to delight in, it was a meal to endure, a reminder of the quiet monotony that ruled everyday life. In the end, these humble, often unappetizing foods were not about indulgence or comfort. They were about survival. The bread, the gruel, the barley porridge, they were the foundation upon which life was built. And though they were rough, gritty, and bland, they carried with them the quiet beauty of necessity. Each bite was a step forward, a continuation of life in a world where hunger was a constant companion. It was not the joy of eating that defined these meals, but the strength and perseverance it took to eat them. And in that quiet strength, there was something profoundly human. As we look back on these foods, so hard, so gritty, so bland, we may wonder what they meant to the people who ate them. Were they a reminder of struggle, or perhaps of quiet resilience? Maybe, in the end, they were a little bit of both. But they were never meant to be grand or exciting. They were meant to be enough. And so, as we reflect on the simplicity of survival, we are reminded that food, in its most basic form, is not about luxury or delight. it is about necessity. And in that necessity, we find a quiet beauty, one that speaks to the perseverance of those who lived in a world where each meal was earned, and each bite was a small victory. Primitive dairy and fermentation, sour and murky. Imagine for a moment the quiet rhythm of a medieval kitchen, the warmth, the fire in the hearth. It contrasts with the chill of the morning air, as the slow process of turning milk into something edible begins. It is not a process driven by speed or efficiency, but by patience, by necessity. In this world, dairy products were far from smooth, fresh creations we are accustomed to today. They were thick, sour, and murky, born from a time before refrigeration, before pasteurization, and before we truly understood the science behind food safety. The milk, fresh from the cow or goat, would not last long. The heat of summer could sour it in a matter of hours, and so it had to be transformed, quickly and carefully, into something that could endure. Cheese, butter, and fermented dairy were not just a source of sustenance, they were part of the very fabric of survival. Sour milk, often referred to as clabber, was a common sight in medieval kitchens. Fresh milk, left out in the open air, would begin to sour, curdling slowly into a thick, unpleasant mass. Though unappealing to modern tastes, clabber was not seen as spoiled food. It was simply the natural process of fermentation. In the absence of refrigeration, it was a way of life. For those who lived in the medieval world, sour milk was not a waste. It was an opportunity. The curds would be separated from the whey and turned into cheese, a process that took time and care. It was the slow, deliberate transformation of something as simple as milk into a more stable, enduring form. Though the taste of clabber might have been sharp, even unpleasant, it was an integral part of the daily diet. Fermentation also found its way into the world of beverages. Ale and cider, brewed in the homes of both peasants and nobles alike, were not always the clean, clear drinks we might expect today. The yeast would cloud the liquid, leaving it murky and unrefined. It was often thick, sour, and sometimes inconsistent in flavour, more a matter of necessity than enjoyment. The ale, brewed at home, was often weak and cloudy. It was not meant for taste, but for sustenance and hydration. In an age where water could not always be trusted, ale was a safer choice, even if it was far from perfect. The cider, too, could vary from batch to batch, sometimes sweet, sometimes sour. But both were drinks of survival, not indulgence. But fermentation, while often a blessing, could also be unpredictable. Without the understanding of bacteria or spoilage, the medieval cook could not always know when things had gone awry. Milk left too long might become not just sour, but curdled and foul. Cheese, if not stored properly, could develop an unpleasant taste, one that even the most patient cook would not tolerate. And ale, if brewed in the wrong conditions, could turn sour, or worse, ferment too much, becoming something nearly undrinkable. Yet, despite the risks and imperfections, fermentation was a process they relied on. It was the slow, uncertain art of turning something that could spoil into something that could sustain. It was not a perfect science, but it was a way of life. As we reflect on the simple, sometimes sour, and often murky dairy and fermented foods of the medieval world, we see not just a history of food, but a history of survival. These foods were not created for pleasure, but for sustenance. They were the result of patience, practice, and an intimate connection with the rhythms of the earth. In each clumsy curd, in every thick, sour butter, in the murky ale, there is a quiet beauty. It is the beauty of endurance, of making do with what was available, of turning the imperfection of nature into something that could sustain life. In this we find the true spirit of the medieval world, a world where survival was the ultimate goal, and food, in all its simplicity, was both the struggle and the reward. Mystery stews and porridges, the unpredictable dishes of the time. Imagine, if you will, the quiet stillness of a medieval kitchen. The hearth, alive with the soft crackling of a fire, holds the heart of the home. Above it, a large pot simmers slowly, containing whatever ingredients have been gathered, some familiar, others unknown, and still others perhaps left to chance. This is not the world of refined dishes or carefully prepared meals. It is the world of mystery stews and porridges, where each meal is a blend of what is at hand, sometimes unpredictable, often simple, but always a necessity. In this world, the pot is both a vessel for nourishment and a symbol of survival. What is placed inside is a reflection of what could be found: grains, scraps of meat, vegetables, or even herbs that have been gathered in haste. The ingredients, like the seasons themselves, are constantly changing, subject to the whims of the weather, the land, and the harvest. The perpetual stew, a dish that could go on for days, even weeks. In a time when fresh ingredients were often a luxury, this stew was a constant presence in the kitchen, simmering away day after day, fed by whatever scraps could be gathered. New ingredients were added as old ones were consumed, and yet the stew never truly finished. It was, in a sense, a reflection of the seasons, a cycle that began but never ended. The idea of a perpetual stew might seem foreign to us today, where we value variety and freshness, but to those in the medieval world, this was not a dish of choice, but one of necessity. The slow simmering of meat, vegetables, and whatever else could be found created a meal that was both reliable and comforting, albeit unpredictable in its flavour. The constant additions could alter the taste, making each bowl a mystery. No two servings would ever be quite the same. And yet, this was the rhythm of life: steady, ongoing, a meal that kept the hunger at bay. Then there were the dishes that were not meant to impress or to satisfy the taste buds, but simply to fill the stomach. Gruel and pottage, the staples of peasant life, were not meals to savour, but to endure. Made from simple grains like barley, oats, or rye, these dishes were cooked down into thin, soupy textures that left little to the imagination. The gruel, often thin and watery, was a far cry from the hearty, satisfying meals we think of today. It was bland, unappealing even. The pottage, made with similar grains, was a little heartier, a bit thicker, and might have been enriched with the occasional vegetable or scrap of meat, but it was still far from exciting. And yet, these meals were a constant in the life of those who lived through them, a quiet reminder of the endurance required to survive in such a time. There was nothing glamorous about gruel or pottage, but they were reliable, predictably bland, predictably filling. But it was not always the same ingredients in the pot. In a time of limited variety, the contents of the stew or porridge could change from day to day. Some days, there might be fresh vegetables. Other days, only dried herbs or leftover scraps. Sometimes, a small piece of meat would find its way into the pot, giving it a fleeting taste of richness before it, too, disappeared into the mix. This unpredictability was both a blessing and a challenge. For the cook, it was an act of quiet creativity, knowing how to blend the ingredients together to create a meal, even when those ingredients were sparse or unfamiliar. Every meal was a new mystery, not in its preparation, but in its outcome. The taste could be different each time, depending on what had been added, what had been left out, and how the flavours had melded over time. There was beauty in this uncertainty. Each meal was a reflection of what had been gathered, a symbol of the seasons as they passed, and the quiet adaptations required to survive. At the heart of the medieval kitchen, there was always the cauldron, the large, heavy pot hung over the fire, filled with whatever could be found, simmering away. It was the centre of the home, where meals began and ended. The cauldron represented both comfort and monotony. It was a place where food could be transformed, where the ordinary could become extraordinary, if only in the act of survival. The pot, bubbling away day after day, was not just a container for food, but a symbol of the slow, steady work of maintaining life. It was always there, always simmering, always providing, never fast, never grand, but always present. In the end, the mystery stew and the humble porridge were not about excitement or innovation. They were about necessity. They were the quiet companions of a life that required constant adaptation and patience. Each spoonful was not a taste of luxury, but a quiet reminder of the resilience required to live in such a world. There was comfort in the consistency of these meals. Though the flavors were often muted, even unpleasant, the act of eating them was never without purpose. The food in the pot, whatever it may have been, kept the hunger at bay and the body moving forward. And in this there was peace. A quiet, undisturbed peace that came from knowing that, though nothing was certain, there was always something in the pot. And that, perhaps, was enough. Imagine, for a moment, the steady rhythm of life in the medieval world. There is no rush, no hurry. Every task is purposeful, deliberate, as the day unfolds at its own pace. The food that sustains these lives is not chosen for its flavor, nor its appearance, but for its ability to provide, simply, steadily, and without complaint. In a world where survival was always on the line, the foods that people relied on were not born of luxury or indulgence, but out of necessity. These humble, sometimes unappealing meals, stale bread, salted meats, gruel, were more than mere sustenance. They were lifelines, woven into the very fabric of daily existence. To survive was to make do with what was available, to find comfort in the simplest of meals. In this world, food was not a luxury, but a quiet companion, always present, always needed. Survival in the medieval world was marked by the constant threat of scarcity. The rhythm of life was shaped by the harvest. Each year a gamble, each season a question. Would the crops grow, or would famine take hold? The Malthusian trap, a quiet cycle between population growth and the available food supply, kept its grip on every household. When the harvest failed, or when the land could not provide, the struggle to eat became more dire. And yet, even in these moments of uncertainty, there was resilience. The foods that people turned to in times of famine, tree bark, acorns, and the hard grains of rye and barley, were not simply desperate measures. They were the tools of survival, shaped by the slow, methodical work of those who understood that even in the face of hunger, the need to endure was stronger than the desire for taste. The medieval world was shaped not by clocks or calendars, but by the unchanging rhythm of the seasons. In spring there was hope, the promise of new crops, new life. In summer, the long hours of labour under the sun, the sweat on the brow, were rewarded with a harvest, but never a guarantee. By autumn, the bounty was stored, though never enough to stave off the coming cold. And in winter, the world seemed to sleep, with only the preservation of food standing between the household and hunger. Food, in this world, was deeply tied to the seasons. It was never abundant in the way we might imagine today. There were no endless shelves of fresh produce, no year-round variety. Every meal, every dish, was a reflection of the cycles of nature, of what could be grown, preserved, and relied upon. The foods that filled the stomach were not the luxuries of an abundant harvest, but the hard-won sustenance that came from the careful use of what had been stored, preserved, and made to last. Not all regions of medieval Europe were created equal. The land, the climate, the geography, all shaped what people could eat and how they could survive. In coastal regions, fish became a staple, preserved in salt or smoked, a vital food source for those who lived by the sea. In the forested regions, nuts, berries, and wild game could be found, though they were never guaranteed. On the plains, grains like barley, oats, and rye were the foundation of every meal. Each region required its own quiet adaptations. People ate what they could grow, what the land would yield, and what could be preserved. And though the foods varied, they all shared one common thread. They were born from the earth, from the land, and from the need to survive, quietly shaped by the landscape that surrounded them. Waste was a luxury the medieval world could not afford. Every part of an animal, every scrap of food, was used. The bones were boiled for broth, the scraps of meat were made into pies, the fat was rendered for cooking. There was no room for excess, no space for what could not be made into something useful. The act of eating was not about indulgence, but about making do with what was available. This efficiency, this quiet respect for every part of life, was not a choice, but a necessity. It was an unspoken understanding that every scrap, every leftover, was precious. In this world, nothing could go to waste. Every part of the animal, every leftover root, every unripe fruit became a source of sustenance. And in this quiet frugality, there was a profound understanding of the need to survive. While the majority of medieval people relied on the humble, predictable meals of bread, gruel, and salted meats, the nobility lived in a different world. For them, food was not just sustenance, it was a symbol of status, a display of wealth and power. Exotic spices, roasted game, and sweet wines were the markers of a life removed from the struggles of the common folk. But even for the rich, food was not a guarantee. Seasons of poor harvests could affect everyone, rich and poor alike. The stark difference, however, was in the ability to weather these shortages. While peasants might go without, nobility had the resources to import goods, to barter for better quality. Food was not just a matter of survival for them, it was a way to showcase their place in the world. As we look back on the foods that sustained the medieval world, stale bread, salted meats, gruel, and simple stews, we may wonder why these foods, so simple and sometimes unappealing, were the cornerstone of survival. The answer, perhaps, lies not in the food itself, but in the necessity of making do. These foods were not chosen for their taste or appearance, but for their ability to sustain, to provide, and to endure. In a world where hunger was a constant companion, where every meal was a struggle, these foods were a quiet comfort. They filled the stomach, yes, but they also symbolized the resilience of those who lived through these difficult times. The food was not indulgence, but survival. And in that survival, there was strength, there was comfort, and perhaps there was peace. And with that, dear listener, we gently close the final page of tonight's journey through a shimmering past. Whether you now dream of silken gowns or scented pomanders, may your sleep be sweet and your imagination soft as velvet. Thank you for joining us. Rest well, take care of your beautiful self, whatever that means to you, and until next time, good night.